In spite of the political and economic problems facing Israel, a great deal of time and effort goes into archaeology. It's become a sort of natural Israeli thing, partly inspired, of course, by a desire to confirm the Jewish past, and partly from being the land bridge of the Eastern Mediterranean in antiquity. One's acutely conscious that history has walked back and forth across this land, up and down the Jordan Valley, across the deserts to the south and the mountain areas to the north of Galilee. There's hardly a square foot in the country which isn't a potential site, a factor that keeps the Israeli State Antiquity Service and the universities busy with hundreds of rescue jobs a year, plus a weighty program of long-term excavation and research. One remote area, for example, where some energetic new work's going on, is the Golan Heights, which Israeli and Syrian forces fought over during the Six-Day War. You still see a lot of unexploded shells lying around, smashed tanks and overturned lorries tangled in rusting barbed wire, and apart from some recent Jewish settlements, a deserted landscape with empty and derelict Syrian towns and villages. But there are also some remarkable towns from antiquity, and archaeologists are just beginning to realize what a wealth of structures dating from the 2nd century AD still exist up there. Entire villages, towns and little cities dating from Roman and Byzantine periods still standing after 16 or 1700 years. They were inhabited on and off over the centuries, even up until 1967. And Dr. Claudine Dauphin, who's doing the first full-scale survey of this area for the State Antiquity Service, took me to a place called Couchenier. It was a town laid out on top of a hill with a Roman type of street grid pattern. Unlike the Romans, these Jewish settlers from the 2nd and 3rd centuries had no public buildings, although in some of the other towns, baths and synagogues were found. There was no city wall as such, but the solid back walls of the houses around the perimeter of the town provided the defensive bulwark. We approached one of the main gates through 6-foot thistles and nettles, which had to be cut away with a machete by someone walking ahead to clear a path. This must be quite a hazard when you're doing a survey, trying to get through vegetation like this.
The big problem is not only going through, but actually taking measurements with such vegetation, which is so high, because one can't use a theodolite, since the nettles are higher even than the line of vision. And one has to do preliminary surveying only through pacing. And it's only later in the summer months, particularly in the autumn, when the nettles have dried out, that one can really see whole buildings and measure them properly.
Let's go through this gateway then and see what's behind the city walls.
Through the gate and through, well, over the threshold of the main city gate, into a courtyard, and then a street immediately starts to our left.
How much are you learning about Byzantine architecture from this survey? Are you breaking any new ground?
We're breaking a lot of new ground because, first of all, the Golan is the only area in this part of the world where Byzantine remains have survived so well, partly due to the fact that they were built in basalt. The other area is northwestern Syria, but it's a completely different culture.
So we're looking at unique Byzantine remains here.
They're unique from many points of view. They're unique because of the urban layouts. They're unique because of the plan of each building, with perfectly preserved arches, doorways, lintels, often still with inscriptions. And they're particularly unique because they are the archaeological evidence for literary texts of the same period, rabbinical law codes, which describe life in the Galilee and the Golan between the 2nd and the 5th century AD.
We've got to a corner of the city now where there's a doorway we'll have to duck under, and inside, what have we got?
Yet another very large arch on the left, which is a sort of small arched room, and to the right, entering through another doorway, we shall enter into one of the main rooms of the houses, which there again is arched.
And inside?
And inside, using a torch to see better.
Now this has got the roof on. This is the first building I've seen with the roof.
The roof, and here one sees very clearly how these ceilings were made. They were made with stone beams supported by projecting stones and covered over by slabs. And over that, one would have had sometimes again, this pisé rolled over with a stone roller.
A sort of mud plaster over the roof.
That's right, yeah, which would also protect the rooms from the cold and the heat.
And again, a magnificent arch spanning the entire width of the room.
And if you notice that the windows are extremely small, I believe, in fact, that they're not really windows. There are only small apertures protecting this area. We must remember that this house is part of the rampart, and it overlooks, on sort of this volcanic outcrop, it overlooks all the fields and territory around it, so that the people living in the house would actually be protecting part of the city by looking out.
The fact that this has remained intact for 1,500 years says a lot for the skill of those Byzantine builders, doesn't it?
Well, the buildings are very well constructed in dry stone walling, well-quarried stones, and the whole rests on a system of balance and equilibrium between voussoir stones, or the cornerstone of arches, and then the overlying ceilings of stone.
Now, this is the first time that a survey in depth has been done of these settlements, isn't it?
Well, a topographical survey, yes. Originally, there was a very preliminary survey was done in '68, not only of these Golan settlements, but of all the archaeological periods in the Golan, so that the original surveyors were not interested in the urban layout, in the actual plan of each building as we are, because what we're trying to do is reconstruct the life of Jewish and Christian communities in the Golan in the period between the Roman and the Byzantine empires.
In fact, how much is there to learn?
There's a lot to learn. First of all, we've only done a very preliminary survey of 17 settlements, and there are actually 90 known sites, to which one must add probably another 20, which are completely uncharted. And from a complete survey, we will be able to compare plans and urban layouts of settlements, to compare masonry between settlements, also the use of the environment, use of water, road network, and also to verify the historical text.
But searching for the past is very different in the deserts further south. The great wilderness of Sinai, reaching right down to the Suez Canal. Like the Golan, it's an area which Israeli archaeologists have had a chance to explore in the wake of bitter fighting. They've made the most of their opportunity and have uncovered cities and settlements under the sand which nobody knew were there. Over 1,000 such sites have been found, including many 13th century BC Egyptian fortresses which protected the road of Horus, the highway that linked the Nile Delta with Palestine. Exploration of Sinai is still going on, but with the Israeli army pulling back to Israel's own border again, archaeologists now have limited time on their side. Exploration of the Sinai has been mainly organized from the Ben Gurion University of the Negev, and there at Beersheba, I visited a public exhibition of objects found during the excavations in the desert. Taking me around the display cases, Professor Eliza Oren, head of the university's archaeological division.
This is a map showing our area of activity. I like to describe it as our Indian territory here. We started 8 years back with the Suez Canal, and we keep on moving systematically using aerial photos eastwards along the Mediterranean strip or coastal strip of northern Sinai, and the objective is to reach Gaza, namely the first civilized Canaanite center in Canaan. Today we are more than halfway through this project. In the course of our work, we have encountered already over 1,000 sites, all sorts from large cities through military forts to temporary shelters, ranging in time from mainly the Chalcolithic, namely 4th millennium BC, all the way down to the medieval period.
So there's a vast amount of material to be discovered as you work through this survey.
There is certainly a great deal of material, and it's a new world, I would say, opening up, because we knew very little, next to nothing, about the history of this region, despite the fact that this was the most vital way of communication between Egypt and Asia, as we all know.
The best-known references in the Bible to Sinai are the wandering of the Israelites through the desert for 40 years. I wonder if archaeology is producing any evidence to support those biblical references.
Naturally, this was one of the questions we kept on asking. Now, after 8 years of systematic work in northern Sinai, I think I can come out with some statements suggesting with no hesitation that we haven't got anything to confirm that the Israelites really used northern Sinai for their travels.
But how can you be so sure about that?
The sites which are believed to be identified with the route of the Israelites have been explored by us, excavated by us. They did not produce anything earlier than the Persian period, namely 5th century or even, or perhaps 6th century BC, but nothing earlier, and we all know that the Exodus took place in the 13th century BC. So there is no archaeological evidence in these key sites or pivotal sites for the wandering of the Israelites in this region.
Now, if they didn't go along the coastal Mediterranean strip of Sinai, where did they cross?
Well, that's not a question for me to answer. I haven't explored other parts of Sinai. All I can suggest that it did not take place in the northern part. The central Sinai theory is as good as the southern Sinai theory for that purpose. Until some solid archaeological evidence would come forward, I think that this question is now thrown back to the archaeologists.
Now, this is a most impressive display. You've got some pots here, huge pots.
It is a collection of amphoras illustrating the different uses, and each one has got a story. Let's take this one on the right. For me, it is the most exciting one.
And probably the smallest of the whole collection.
It is the smallest and the most exciting one, for the very simple reason. We have excavated near the Suez Canal, right on the bank of the Suez Canal, on the east bank of the Suez Canal, a very large fortress, which for various reasons we believe it was manned by Greek mercenaries, the first Greeks who arrived as mercenaries in the 7th century, 6th century BC during the Saite period in Egypt. We know that this area was very cosmopolitan. It was occupied by Greek trading colonies like Naocrates and Daphne and other places, as well as Jews who escaped from the Babylonian destruction or activity, Syrians, Arabs, Phoenicians, and others. This one in particular is a wine amphora coming from the island of Samos in East Greece. It is a wine amphora. We know from Greek sources that Samos was one of the largest producers of the time, and so we can know exactly what kind of wine was held in this one. Now, this one was found in a cremation burial near the site, near the fortress I just mentioned. We found an Egyptian vase with the cremated bone in it. Next to it were two Greek Samian amphorae given as gifts. So this would be the earliest evidence for Greek arrival or arrival of Greeks, both as merchants and mercenaries, into the Eastern Delta.
How did you feel about that when you came across that grave?
Very exciting. There is another story to it. Look at it now. It's right under surface. Namely, when we came there, we saw some 2 meters away from the main road leading down to the canal area, we saw the 3 circles, and this was some 2 meters away from the road. Can you imagine a truck, a heavy truck, just taking off? And he would ruin it in no time. This was lying there from the 7th or early 6th century BC.